I feel like kohlrabi is such an underrated crop. Like, more people should be growing this. It is part of the brassica family, like broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage. However, it is way easier to grow than those crops, in my opinion. So here in my Florida garden, it's a struggle trying to properly grow heading types of brassicas like cauliflower and broccoli, because our winter weather just fluctuates so much. All of a sudden we have a cold day, and then it's followed by many days of warmth. So that will trigger broccolis and cauliflowers to, instead of forming a nice head, they'll just go to the flowering stage. So it gets tricky. Some years are better than others. But I find that kohlrabi doesn't have that issue because, for one, it's not trying to form a head. Instead, kohlrabi forms like a swollen bulb, and this is not a bulb underground, so it's not a root crop, but it does form like this edible bulb portion above ground. Actually, all of the members of the brassica family came from one plant that was bred and manipulated by humans over thousands of years to get different kinds of variations. That's how we get broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and kohlrabi. Every part of the kohlrabi plant is edible, but what is more desirable is the bulb. Personally, I like to grate it up and add it to my salads like raw. It just adds a nice, fresh crisp to my salads. It can also be shredded into slaws, it can be pickled, it can even be fried like French fries. I also really like the greens for my chickens. They taste just like collard greens or any kind of like leaves that you would get from kale or cabbage, something like that. But my favorite way to use them, honestly, is to throw them to my chickens. I will be harvesting all of this kohlrabi today, but first I want to talk to you guys how I grew this from seed all the way to harvest. Just so you know, you can find a copy of this growing guide in written form on my website, jarahsgarden.com. There's a blog section that's called Gardening Info and Growing Guides. So I have all my video growing guides on my YouTube channel written down on the blog section. And there's also a lot of other very useful gardening information, especially my monthly growing guides. So if you want to follow along with whatever seeds or things that I'm transplanting in my garden by month, you can find all of that information there. So let's talk about cultivar selection. There really honestly isn't much of a difference between them. I mean, they come in different colors, some in white, green, or purple. This variety here is the purple variety because I think it's just so beautiful, but they all have the same white interior. And there's not much difference between heat tolerances, but I do hear that in general, any kind of purple or dark colored vegetable tends to have a little bit more of a heat tolerance than its regular variety. Lastly, there might be a little bit of difference in size. In general, you want to harvest the kohlrabi when they're like 3 inches in diameter. That's basically the size of like a tennis ball. But there is a giant cultivar that naturally just gets bigger in size when it's ready to harvest. Let's talk about sowing the seeds. My preference is to direct sow this particular crop. Now, it's not a root crop because all root crops you really need to direct sow them. It technically is forming, it's like a bulb above ground. But if you start it in 72 cell seed trays or 4-inch pots, you have to be really careful when you're transplanting it that you're not going to disturb the root system or cause any kind of damage or disturbances to the taproot that it sends down. General sowing guidelines are going to say something like direct sow the seeds immediately after your last spring frost has left, or 3 months before your first winter frost of the season moves through your area. If you don't know your average frost dates, you can go check out a website called plantmaps.com, and I'll link it below. You put in your zip code and it'll give you a lot of important gardening information specific to your area, including your frost dates. Growing any kind of brassicas is really challenging in warmer climates like mine. I'm in Orlando, Florida, zone 9B. I would say if you're a zone 8 or up gardener, it can be a little challenging to grow these kinds of things. Kohlrabi specifically needs 3 months in a row of like temperate or cool temperatures to develop properly. If you try to grow them during a hot time of the year, like summer or something like that, it's not going to work. The heat will stunt their growth and they'll stay super tiny for a long time, and they might not ever recover from that. If you're in a warm garden like me, it might be easier to just decide to grow your kohlrabi and other brassicas during its ideal growing temperature range. And for kohlrabi, that's 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. As an example, in my garden, I like to direct sow these seeds in October, like the middle or the end of October, and then I will start harvesting about 3 months later. You're going to want to pick a spot that gets at least 6 hours of sunlight. Like they could take some shade. So this spot gets really, really bright morning sun, but like complete afternoon shade. But it does really well growing in those kinds of conditions or full sun. Kohlrabi grows best in soil that is like full of organic matter. But if you're in a state like Florida where you have very sandy soil, it will grow good in sandy soil, but you need to make sure that you fertilize frequently and make sure that you monitor the watering situation, because it's sandy soil, the nutrients in the water just wash right out very quickly. You're going to want to direct sow some seeds 1 foot apart. So I have this weed blocking material here and I burn holes into it since it's plastic. Every 1 foot, so it's already spaced out for me, and I just took a few seeds and sprinkled them into each hole. You don't really have to cover with any soil. They're very tiny seeds, so I just like to press them down into the soil surface to make sure that they make contact, and then keep it really, really moist until they germinate. Just like other members of the brassica family, they germinate pretty quickly, like within 3 to 5 days. This crop doesn't get too big or out of control. Like it does get a little bit wide, but it stays shorter to the ground, usually no more than 2 feet tall. So I actually think it makes a great companion planting for other taller crops, like if you're growing tomatoes, because here in my Florida garden, I am growing tomatoes during the wintertime. Since you've sprinkled a few seeds per each 1 foot spacing, you're going to get more than one that germinates most likely. And you should thin it out to just one plant, or the strongest seedling that you notice, per 1 foot. Now this one here, I allowed 2 other ones to start growing with it, and it's okay, like they have space. This one here is definitely ready for harvest. This one is still small, and I'm gonna leave it a little bit longer so it'll size up, but just as long as they're not bunched together and like touching each other, hitting each other, you're good to go. What you don't want is for them to be growing and smashing into each other, because that will prevent them from spreading out or, gaining in size. If you're going to start your own transplants though, I recommend that you sow them in these 72 cell seed trays. You're going to want to start seeds about 10 weeks before whatever your target date is for transplanting them into your garden. Any zone that is lower or colder than zone 8, you're going to want to transplant these about 2 weeks before your last spring frost date. If you're in a warmer zone like me, which is basically zones 8 and up, and you have a target date of, let's say, October to transplant them in your garden, you're going to backtrack 10 weeks from there and start them from seed in your seed trays. That will land you probably at the end of July, which it's still really, really hot outside in July. So if you're going to start your own seeds for transplants, make sure that you keep them indoors. The heat outside will stunt your little seedlings and they probably won't ever recover. One thing to keep in mind about kohlrabi, which is kind of unique compared to other vegetable crops, is if you are planting your transplants in the ground, they don't like loose soil. Like you have to actually compact that soil down. So I just pop my little transplant out, put it in its hole, and then press with my fingers all around it deep down into the soil to make sure it's not loose and it's nice and snug. If you're enjoying this video and learning something new, make sure you subscribe to my channel. That way you get notified of every time I post new videos. Your support is greatly appreciated and motivates me to create more videos just like this one. Also, make sure you connect with me on social media. I am on Instagram and TikTok. I'm most active on TikTok, where I post it daily. Now that your kohlrabi seedlings are growing, let's talk about its requirements. They do require about 1 inch of water during the growing season every single week. Make sure that you soak the soil thoroughly and do not water again until the first 2 inches or 3 inches of soil is completely dried out. If you're in Florida like me, you're growing this during fall, winter, and spring, which is also our dry time of the year. It's our dry season. So just pay a little bit of extra attention and make sure that they are staying consistently moist. If the kohlrabi plants get stressed out from maybe being overheated or they're not getting enough water, it actually causes them to taste bitter. It can also cause the bulbs to be fibrous and or crack. As for their growth habit, as you can see, they're pretty bushy. It reminds me of kale, and they have very broad leaves. This one is really pretty. I love growing the purple one because even the stems and the leaves have like purple veining in them. I almost don't want to harvest them because I love looking at them. The more leaves the plant will have, that just means it's able to harvest more energy from the sun and then produce nice big bulbs. Therefore, I don't recommend that you prune any of these leaves unless you find one that is very diseased or it's turning yellow or just dying off. You might as well remove those. Since leafy green growth is so important to get really good bulb formation, I like to fertilize initially with blood meal. This is an organic product. It's basically pure nitrogen. So if you're direct sowing seeds, I like to scratch into the soil or the surrounding soil with a bunch of blood meal. That'll give the seeds a nice head start. If you're transplanting, I like to put a nice handful of blood meal in the transplanting hole and kind of work it in with the soil before you pop your transplants in. About halfway through the growing period, so at 1.5 to 2 months, I will start fertilizing with something that incorporates the other nutrients, the phosphorus and the potassium, so that I can encourage more bulbing growth instead of leafy growth. Let's talk about the pests and diseases that you might encounter when you're growing kohlrabi. Luckily for me, I'm growing kohlrabi during the coldest time of the year here in Florida, so naturally the pest and disease pressure is pretty low. You might get some worm issues, and you know you have worms when you find that your leaves are all chewed up, and you'll start seeing like little balls that are either like yellow, orange, green, sometimes black. That is basically the eggs of the worms or their poop. And you don't tend to see them, especially during the day, because a lot of those worms tend to be nocturnal. Whenever I have a worm issue in my garden, I like to spray with BT or spinosad. Both of those are considered organic products. Another common pest that you might find are flea beetles. So if you notice that your leaves have a lot of little holes in them, that's caused by the flea beetles. I recommend that you just use row covers at that point because it basically blocks them from getting onto your plants. Let's talk about some of the diseases that you might encounter while you're growing kohlrabi. They are fairly susceptible to root rot, which is caused by overwatering or just too much moisture in general. So if that is an issue in your garden, I recommend that you grow these in raised beds or in containers to help with drainage. Another issue that you might see is club roots, which basically is where these roots are. They are misshapen and they look like a club. There is no cure for that, so the best bet is actually to just yank out the whole plant so it doesn't spread to your other plants. Do not compost any of the plants that are infected with club root because you can't guarantee that composting will kill all of those pathogens and it can spread to the rest of your garden. Club root also affects other members of the Brassica family, so yeah, I'm not going to compost with that material if I do have a plant infected with club root. Lastly, if you get any leaf diseases, I'm in Florida, we get them all at some point. It's just something you're going to have to deal with. Leaf diseases can include like powdery mildew, blight, spotting, yellowing of the leaves. Whenever I see that, I just prune those leaves out, or even leaves that are damaged or just getting old and dying off. It is said that those damaged leaves and stuff will actually attract pests to the plant as they can sense that it's a stressed out plant. So it's just best to keep your plants clean and remove any of those types of leaves. If you have a very bad leaf disease, I do like to spray with 1 cup of hydrogen peroxide per gallon of water. That basically kills all the pathogens that cause those leaf diseases. Hopefully you follow all those tips and tricks and you're able to harvest beautiful mature kohlrabi about 3 months from starting the seeds. So let's get to my favorite part about gardening, and that is harvest time. I'm going to harvest these kohlrabi. Actually, they're kind of past their prime. You want to harvest them when they are 3 inches in diameter. That's just when they are the best for eating, right? They're not going to be woody or anything like that. I think I'll be okay with these. But as with most crops, when I harvest, I like to cut them at the base where they hit like the soil surface, and I leave all of the root systems intact inside of the soil because those roots will continue to break down and they feed the beneficial microorganisms of my soil. I'm just going to use some scissors here and cut them off. Let's see what we have. And this is why I say it's a pretty good crop to decide to grow like under tomatoes, because when you harvest this, you're not going to be disturbing the roots of the tomato plants or any other, crops or plants that you're growing along with it, since I'm just leaving them all intact. But, oh, they're all stuck together. Look at that. Isn't it beautiful? Look at all those colors. I love growing purple kohlrabi. You guys should give it a try. If you've never grown kohlrabi, give it a try at least once. This one right here is the biggest one out of all of them so far. And if the other ones aren't ready yet, you could just leave them there. Don't harvest them. They'll continue growing as long as, the temperatures and the weather doesn't get too hot. Like here in Florida, if you haven't harvested all your kohlrabi by around March, it's starting to get too late. They're going to get too hot, and it's not good for just the texture and flavor. Look at my harvest. And there's a couple more here that I need to harvest immediately. But what you want to do after harvest is remove all of these leaves, because they will continue to suck nutrients and water out of the roots, and it'll make the roots like kind of have a weird flimsy kind of texture instead of being nice and crisp. Then you're going to wash them off, let them dry 100% before you put them in the fridge. I like to put them in like a Ziploc bag with a piece of paper towel to absorb any extra moisture. Thank you for watching. I hope you guys learned something new, and if you haven't tried growing kohlrabi, please give it a try and then comment below. I want to know how your harvests are doing. Was it successful? If you have any like additional information for me, maybe some techniques or varieties of kohlrabi that you really love to grow, please comment below. I learned just as much from you guys as you do from me.